We're continuing our study, Mirz Hashem, of the Tosfos at the beginning of Perek Ben Sorah Morer, Sanhedrim Daf Samachet Amud Beis, Katan. And Tosfos asks the following question. We presented this question last week. Let's review it. The parsha here that we're studying in the Gemara about Katan has to do with a case where there's a Tainus Gzela in which the Tovea is demanding of a person that he return Gzela, that he stole something. So that's going to be the Taina of a Katan. And as a result, the Nitba, the accused Gazlan, is going to take a Shvuah to be Machish the Taina of the Katan. And Tosfos asks the following question. And you'll see this at the end of the middle size lines on Daf Samachet Amud Beis. V'im Tomar, Hech Yischayev Adam Asham al Gzela. As a result of the fact that Shimon denied the claim of Gzela and took a shvuah to that effect, and now he confesses his crime, he has to bring a korban asham, and it's all based on a shvuah that he took, a false oath. He perjured himself under oath as a result of the taina, in this case, of a katan. So Reuven was a katan, Shimon was the accused Gazlan, who took a shvuah to be machish the taina of the katan, and then subsequently he confesses that he took a false shvuah. He has to bring a korban asham, he has to pay a ken v'chomesh, and Tosfos says, Hey, Yischayev Adam Asham al Gzelo. How could there possibly be such a scenario where the Gazlan would take an oath and therefore subsequently he'll have to bring a korban asham because he took a false oath? How could that possibly be? We have a principle which the Gemara in Bava Kama Daf Kuf Vavam and Beis derives from a pasuk that excludes the taina of a katan. So, for example, if a katan says you owe me 100, and you admit on 50 and deny 50, and you're chayv shvuas modu mixas, you will not take that shvuah because a katan does not have a power of taina. Ein nishbain al tainas katan. So the entire parsha here of korban asham, in the case of a katan who is tovea, he's the plaintiff, he's the tovea. This whole parsha doesn't exist. Just rip it out of the Torah, because you can never have a metzius of a shvuah to be machish the taina of a katan, because ein nishban al tainas katan. And this principle of ein nishban al tainas katan is derived from the pasuk ki yitain ish. And whenever it says ish in the Torah excludes a katan, and ish means the ish gave an object over to a shomer, and then the shomer denies that he ever got it, or he claims he returned it, and so forth and so on. He has to take a Shevuas HaShomrim. But since the Torah says ish, it's lima'ute katan. So a katan cannot generate a shvuah. And if that be the case, the entire parsha of Asham Gzelos with regard to a katan just simply doesn't exist. And the Gemara is telling us that if you have a ger katan, if you remember, then there's no goel, and we know that the Gazlan, when he confesses his crime, is going to have to pay up the gzela to the kohanim because there is no yoresh. A ger katan does not have a yoresh. He's not capable of having children. He's a katan, and he's a ger, so he's not related to any of his biological relatives. And how does this parsha of a ger katan who's being mechayev a shvuah, and therefore the Gazlan who took that shvuah now confesses that he took a false oath and he has to bring a korban asham, how could that ever exist? What kind of a shvuah could possibly be generated by a katan when ein nishbain al tainas katan? Now let's just fast forward to Tosfos' second answer. Tosfos says, B'kofetz v'nishba. Ein achinami. There's no way that a katan could possibly generate a shvuah. But this Gazlan took the shvuah on his own initiative. He wanted to fact that his claim was an honest claim. So he says, you know what? I'm even willing to take a shvuah. And before you know it, he took hold of a Sefer Torah, what we call Nikitas Chayfetz, and he took the oath. Now he confesses, he did tshuva, and he has to bring a korban asham. So that's not the answer that we want to focus our attention on. We're going to look at the first answer in Tosas. Tosas says, Yesh lomar dahaini mili b'tainas kfira voda, otherwise known as moda v'mixas hataina. So if the Katan demands as a litigant, as a plaintiff, 100 from the defendant confesses to 50, denies the other 50, ein nishbain al tainas Katan. The Katan, through kfira and hoda, could not generate a shvuah. Avol al pi echad nishbaim. Now we have a different shvuah. Right? There are three categories of shvuah d'oraisa. Let's just review them. Number one is moda v'miktsas. Number two is echad, and number three is shvuas hashomer. And now we're focusing our attention on two out of the three categories. Later we'll get to the third category. And we set up the following contrast. If you're dealing with shvuas, moda v'miktsas taina, then the Katan could not generate such a shvuah. But if you're dealing with the shvuas echad, meaning that the Echad testifies to support the claim of this plaintiff, or this Tovea, then even if, claims Tosfos, the Tovea is a Katan, nevertheless, as a result of the Eidus of the Echad, the Nitba, in this case the Gazlan, has to take a Shvuah. And we're dealing with a shvuah d'oraisa, my friends. This is not a shvuah d'rabbanan, because we're trying to justify a parsha in the Torah of Hasham Gzelos. Now, there are a number of questions we have to ask over here. Not the least of which, what's the difference between a shvuas moda and miktas, which cannot be generated by the Tainas Katan, and a shvuas eid echad, which can be generated by a Tainas Katan. And then after that, we have to figure out, in general, how do you circumvent the problem of ein nishbain al tainas Katan by introducing an eid echad. So here we have to raise the following chakira, a very basic, I mean, you could call it a lamdasha yeshivisha chakira, but it's very, very basic. When the Torah says that the nitba, the defendant, has to take a shvuah in the case of eidus shel eid echad, what are we saying over here? Are we upgrading the status of the taina, meaning the plaintiff's claim is now on a more serious level because we have reason to believe that his claim is true because it's being supported by the testimony of one witness. And therefore, at the end of the day, after the eid echad testifies, it's as a result of the taina of the tovea, we will be machayev shvuah. Now, the taina of a tovea normally would not be mechayev shvuah, but in this case, since it's supported and bolstered and upgraded by the support of an eid echad, therefore it's mechayev shvuah. That's one way of understanding why eid echad is mechayev shvuah. The other way of understanding it is that no, we're not going to say that the shvuah is generated by the taina of the plaintiff of the tovea. We're going to say that the shvuah is generated by the eid echad himself. The eid echad has enough weight and to support as evidence to generate a chiyuv shvuah. If you cannot be machish the shvuah, we say to the defendant, then it means that the eid echad is telling the truth. So the eid echad testifies that Shimon owes Ruvain money. He stole Ruvain's possessions. And Shimon denies that claim. No, I'm chaf mi pesha, I'm not guilty. I didn't steal anything. And therefore, I'm willing to be machish the eid echad. I'm willing to take a shvuah to counter the testimony and reject the testimony of the eid echad. So now we have a battle, so to speak, between the eid echad, who has a certain element of nemanus, and the defendant who's willing to take a shvuah to contradict the Echad. And the Torah says that we'll believe the Shvuah against the Echad, or at least we're in a passive situation here where we won't force the nitba, the defendant, to pay by virtue of the Echad, because the Echad is only believed to the level of Shvuah, and the nitba was willing to take the Shvuah, which in fact he did. Now, let's analyze the nafkamina between these two definitions. It's going to be the case where the Echad is testifying on behalf of Tovea, who's a Katan. If the Echad is simply supporting the taina of the plaintiff, of the Tovea, well, ein nishbain al tainas Katan, just like in the case of Modu Viksa taina, where there is no Echad, there's no chiyuv shvuah, because the taina of the Katan is not enough to generate a chiyuv shvuah. But if I say that, no, forget about the taina of the Tovea. What's being posited here in this confrontation, in this struggle, is the Echad against the nitba. Forget about the Tovea, leave him out of the picture. Obviously, the Echad is coming to prove through his testimony that the nitba owes the Tovea money. Nobody's questioning that premise. But there's evidence here that this nitba owes this money to the Tovea based on the Echad. And until the nitba is capable of taking a shvuah to be makish the Echad, then the testimony of the Echad is accepted. It stands as perfect evidence, as if there were two witnesses. If we take the latter approach, the second definition, that the Shevuas Echad is generated by the aid himself, not by the Tainas HaTovea, which was now upgraded as a result of the support of the testimony of Echad, then it matters not whether the Tovea is a Katan or a Gadol. In both cases, we're going to be Machayev and generate a Shvuah because of the Echad. It's the Echad who's basically standing in front of Bezdin demanding a Shvuah. And Tosfos, in his first answer, is taking a very definite stand on this issue. That despite the fact that Eid Nishbar al Tainas Katan, nevertheless, there will be a Shvuah to be Makish the Eid Echad, because the Eid Echad himself generates that Shvuah. And we're going to try to analyze today the Shitas HaRambam, the Shitas HaRavid, whether they agree or disagree with the Tosfos that Eid Echad stands on his own, independent of the Taina, to be Mechayev Shvuah, and therefore, despite the fact that the Tovea puts forth the Taina's Katan, nevertheless, there will be a Shvuah. Now, what we have to introduce here is a concept called Taina Shema. We have a principle that just like Ein Nishboin al Tainas Katan, so too Ein Nishboin al Tainas Shema. If the litigant who is demanding payment, we call them the plaintiff, the Tovea, is unsure as to whether or not the defendant in fact owes him money, and that's called the Taina Shema, then there's no Shvuah. But now the question is, when, let's say Tovea, we'll call him Ruvain, demands 100. I lent you 100. Comes along Shimon the Nitba, and he says, I paid you back 50. Wait a second, says Ruvain the Tovea. I don't recall that you paid me back. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, we discussed it. We got together. We met on a certain day. And yeah, maybe you did pay me back. Maybe you didn't pay me back. There's no shvuah. Because ein nishbain al taina shema. If you don't have absolute certainty, if you have a shadow of a doubt as to whether or not so-and-so owes you money, there's no shvuah. And now the question is going to be, all right, that's in the case of Modu Vixas, where the Nitba claims I paid you back 50, and the Toveh says maybe you did, maybe you didn't. I'm not sure, one way or the other. No shvuah. But what happens If despite the fact that the Tovea can't recall whether he paid back or not, the Echad could testify that there was no payment. He was with us. This is called in the language of the Shas, Lo zaz mitachas yodenu. This nitba, this love who borrowed money, was with us 24/7. No way, no how could he have paid back the loan. Impossible. Would the nitba in such a case be chayav shvua? Why? Not because of the taina of the tovea. The taina is a taina shema. Taina shema cannot generate a shvua. But because the Eid Echad testifies that Shimon, the nitba, owes Ruvain the 50, therefore Shimon has to take a shvua to be machish the Eid Echad. Because the Eid Echad now stands on his own 2 feet, independent of the tovea, to generate a shvua. And at least according to one Rishon, you're going to tell me which Rishon, if I quiz you, we can definitely come to the conclusion that in this case, the Eid Echad, even though he's supporting a weak taina of a taina shema, would nevertheless generate a shvua. Which Rishon can you quote?
Tosfos.
Tosfos. Because Tosfos says that an Echad could be mechayev a shvua in the case of a Katan. The Katan is a tovea. And nevertheless, the Eid Echad stands on his own, independent of the Tovea and the Taina, and he generates a Shvua. The same thing will apply exactly in the case of a Taina Shema. We don't need the Taina Shema, according to Tosfos, in order to generate a Shvua. All we need is an Eid Echad. And if the Eid Echad could stand on his own 2 feet, then that would generate a Shvua, despite the fact that there's a Taina Shema. And in light of this introduction, some of which we've discussed in the past, we're ready to analyze a Rambam. So I don't know if you have access to a Rambam. I sort of sent it in the WhatsApp. And we're going to look at the 4th chapter of Hilchos Gzela. Perek Dal Hilchos Gzela, Halacha Yud Gimel. And after we see the Rambam, we're going to see the Ravid. And we're going to try to define that machlokus between the Rambam and the Ravid in a very complex scenario in terms of everything that we've been discussing until now. And in fact, the principle of Ein Nishboim al Taina Shema is quoted by the Rosh. Okay. Oh, you're going to send us a link to the Rambam. Unfortunately, I don't have my phone with me now. But hopefully, you'll be able to see the Rambam inside. But first, I want to mention the Rosh. The Rosh at the end of Masechet Shevuos says the following: that according to the Rif, if the Tovea has a Taina Shema, but there's an Eid Echad that supports his claim, again, it's a very weak claim because he's not sure, then the Nitba has to take a Shvuah. Meaning that according to the Rif, we can overlook the fact that the Taina per se could not generate a Shvuah, in this case a Taina Shema, by virtue of the fact that the Eid Echad stands on his own to generate a shvuah. However, the Rosh quotes one of the early Chachmei Ashkenaz, Rabbeinu Ephraim, who disagrees with this position of the Rif and maintains that there's no shvuas Eid Echad in the case of a Taina Shema. And if our logic is correct, then Rabbeinu Ephraim, quoted by the Russian Shevuas, would disagree with our Tosfos here in Sanhedrin. He would not allow an Eid Echad to be mechayev a shvuah in the case of a Katan, because Ein Nishboim al Taina is Katan. Which means that according to Rabbeinu Ephraim, an Eid Echad could only function to be mechayev a shvuah in the capacity of support for the Taina. he bolsters and upgrades the taina, and now the taina generates the shvuah. And therefore, Rabbeinu Ephraim says the taina shema could never generate a shvuah. So in other words, according to Rabbeinu Ephraim, the shvuah always comes from the tviyah and not from the Eid Echad. So what, therefore, would Rabbeinu Ephraim tell us about the case that Tosfos describes, the scenario in which the Katan is Tovea, and there's an Eid Echad to support the Taina of the Katan? Well, obviously, if Rabbeinu Ephraim, in the case of Taina Shema, is arguing that the function and the power of the Eid Echad is just simply to support and give credence and authority to the Tainas HaTviyah, which according to Rabbeinu Ephraim is not going to help us in the Taina Shema, and therefore there will not be a Shvuah despite the testimony of the Eid Echad, so too in the case of a Tainas Katan, if the Eid Echad is coming just to bolster and support the Taina of the Katan to generate a Shvuah, well, guess what? Ein nishbain al Tainas Katan. Which would mean, in the framework of what we have in front of us, at least, that Rabbeinu Ephraim would have to insist that the entire parsha of Hasham Gzelos, in the case of a Ger Katan, revolves around the case of Kafatz v'Nishba, which means that the Nitba, on his own initiative, perhaps to dramatize the truth of his claim, took the Shvuah. Rabbeinu Ephraim would not allow himself the luxury of the first teretz of Tosfos, that the Ger Katan, in the case of the parsha of Hasham Gzelos, could be Mechayev Shvuah through the Eid Echad. The Eid Echad is now the vehicle to be Mechayev Shvuah, because Rabbeinu Ephraim is already committed to the fact that Eid Echad on his own is nothing. There's no such thing as being Mechayev Shvuah through an Eid Echad. Eid Echad is a third party. We need that the litigant himself, in this case the Tovea, should generate the Shvuah. And now we're ready for the Rambam. Perek Daled Milchas Gzela Halacha Yud Gimel. Now let's give a little bit of background to this Rambam. How does an Eid Echad testify, which we're going to talk about in this scenario, the Rambam, that Shimon stole an object from Reuven? What exactly did the Eid Echad witness? What did he see? He watches Shimon enter into the house of Reuven and walk out with a beautiful artistic vase. And now he testifies that Shimon is a no good gazlan. Shimon, for his part, admits he doesn't deny the testimony of the Eid Echad. He confesses that indeed he went into the house of Reuven and walked out with a vase. Who remembers Viceroy's cigarettes? Okay, anyway. So now, what does Shimon say? He claims that that vase was his. He was only taking back that which was rightfully his own. Well, guess what? We believe the Eid Echad. We don't believe Shimon. Which, by the way, is a tricky business, because whenever you go into someone's house to take back that which you claim is yours, you better watch out who's there witnessing what you're doing. So now the question is, would Shimon be chayav to replace that vase? The law is as follows. Eid Echad is mechayev shvuah. A shvuah must be a hakchasha against the Eid. The nitva must contradict the Eid. and deny his testimony. It's false. In event that the nitva cannot take the shvua, we have a principle called mitoch she'eno yachol lishava mishalim. The Echad, as we said before, is Machayev Shvuah because he testifies that Shimon went into Reuven's house and walks out with a vase. And guess what? Shimon cannot take a Shvuah. He could be the most honest person on the face of the earth, but technically he cannot take the Shvuah. Because a Shvuah, in the case of Eid Echad, has to be Makrish the Eid Echad. He's got to deny the testimony of the Eid Echad. He has to say in front of Beis Din that this Eid Echad is a no good liar. He can't do that because he's already confessed that he went into Reuven's house, walked out with his vase. Stop. And if we take a pause, because at this point in our conversation, there's no question that Shimon would have to pay up for the vase or return the vase. One problem. Reuven has a Taina Shema. He himself is uncertain about this vase. He doesn't know for sure. Is it his? Maybe it was deposited in his possession by Shimon, and Shimon was just taking back his own vase. Let's read the Rambam. V'chein, you have it? Im hoyashom eid echad bilvad, balabayis toin shegozel hu kli ze biyado. So at this point in the Rambam's presentation, Reuven, the Tovea, is absolutely sure, he's certain, that Shimon walked off with his vase. The Hala Omer, and what is Shimon's counter argument? Lakuachi biyadu. I took back that which was mine. Long ago, I paid him for this vase. I never picked it up, but I paid him full price. How does Avram Avinu say there? Kesef mole, Oh, alternatively, what does Shimon counter? Bechovi gvisiv. Reuven owed me 1,000. The vase is worth 1,000, and therefore I confiscated his vase. It's mine. Shali hayu pikadenu etzlecha. This is my vase from Sheshis made Brachis, and I deposited it in your possession. So we now have a head-on collision between Reuven the Tovea and Shimon the Nitba. Says the Rambam, Hareze chayev lahachzir akli lebailov. Shimon has to return the kli. Why is this so? I mean, after all, it's Reuven's word against Shimon's word, and Shimon now is the muchzak. He's holding on to the vase. And the Rambam says, wait a minute, can we give Shimon the opportunity to take a shvuah in one of these possible three directions? I deposited, I was taking back that which is mine, he owed me a chov, or I purchased it. Says the Rambam, no. Shimon does not have the option of taking a shvuah. Why? She'ilu hayu sham shnei edim. If there were two witnesses that testified that Shimon walked into the house of Reuven and walked out with his vase, hayachayev lishalim. Despite all the yelling and screaming on behalf of the Nitva of Shimon, yeah, it was mine, and I took it back because it's rightfully mine, and so forth and so on. I bought it, I lent it to you, I collected it as Yechov and debts, and so forth and so on. What do you mean there are two Eidim that testify that you walked into Reuven's house and came out with his vase? Says the Rambam. Now let's get back to our case. In our case, we don't have two witnesses to testify that Shimon walked into the house of Reuven and walked out with a vase. But we have one witness that testifies that indeed Shimon walked out of the house holding the vase of Reuven. Achshav she'ein shav ela eid echad, chayav shvuah. The eid echad is mechayav shvuah. But v'eni yochel yishava, he cannot take the shvuah. Why? Sherei eino makish ha'eid. He cannot counter against the aid. He can't deny what the aid is saying. He admits that he went into Reuven's house and walked out with a vase, just that he claims, well, it was mine. But what kind of shvuah can he take? The only kind of a shvuah you can take in the case of Eid Echad is shvuah lahakrish ha'eid. In other words, to deny the testimony of the aid. He can't do that. He cannot deny the testimony of the aid. Lefichach, says the Rambam, however, if kafar v'yomer lo nechnasti lebeso v'lo natalti klum, if he wants to be machish the aid and take a shvuah to the effect that he didn't go into Reuven's house and walk out with a vase, then hol vein sham el eid echad v'makchisho, he takes the shvuah against the eid echad, harezet nishba shvuas haTorah shelo lokach mi beso klum v'niftar. It's fine. So just before we get to the Ravid, just to summarize, the Rambam is saying that the Eid Echad could be Machayev Shvuah, which the Nitba cannot be Machish, because the Nitba confesses that he did walk into Reuven's house and walk out with his vase. Therefore, we're going to apply the principle of Mitoch Sheni Yochel Yishav Misham. However, if the Nitba could be machish the Eid Echad and deny that he ever took this vase. He never went in there to take the vase. And he's basically willing to take an oath that this Eid is bluffing, is making up a whole story. Then he takes the shvuah to be machish the Eid Echad. I did not take a vase, and he's put. Now, the only point in this whole discussion that is a little bit vague, and it's the main thrust of our discussion today, is the relationship between the Eid Echad and the Toveh. What kind of a tviyah was the plaintiff putting forth in front of Bezdin? Says the Ravid, Omar Avram zeh tema. I can't accept the Rambam. Because the Rambam is saying that the reason why the Nitba, we'll call him Shimon, who's accused of Gzela, would have to pay is because he's Chayav Shvuah. And what makes him Chayav Shvuah? The testimony of Eid Echad. Zeh tema. Me'achar shebal habayis lo hoya sham. The Eid Echad saw Shimon go into the house of Reuven and walk out with the vase. Reuven the Baal Habayis was not there at the time. Eich yesh kan tainas bari. How can you talk about a chiyuv shvuah based on a taina which is not a tainas bari? Kedei sheyeh zeh mechuyev shvuah sheni yochel yishava. And the Rambam adds a whole piece over here. I'm sorry, the Ravid adds a whole piece over here. He says, Ulai nomar, Achashim te'ena biyado, Tainas barihi. Okay, Reuven was not there, present at the time when Shimon walked into his house and took out a vase. But nevertheless, he sees his vase in the hands of Shimon. Is afal pishalo rock shotzio mi beso, even though he didn't see him when he came out of his house. El Sha'ed Meid. When he calls Adin, Gaon Cholek Olav Udvar of Hem Divrei Arav Sal Ad Kan Lashon. The Ravid is outspoken about the fact that the Tovea has a Tainus Shema and not a Tainus Bari. Why is the Ravid insisting that the Tovea had a Tainus Shema? Says the Ravid that Balabais lo hoyasham, he wasn't there present, right? The Echad is saying, I was there and I saw Shimon grab onto a vase and take it out of the house. Reuven wasn't there at the time that supposedly Shimon took the vase out of the house. Shimon himself agrees and admits and confesses that he took the vase out of Reuven's house. Says the Ravid, despite the fact that Reuven says, look, I see my vase in the possession of Shimon, nevertheless, he still has only a Tainus Shema. And the Ravid registers the sheet of the Gaon to the effect that since Reuven's Tainus is a Tainus Shema, Shimon will not take a Shvuah to be Makish the Echad. Or can we formulate it in a simpler way that the Gaon sheet, as quoted by the Ravid, is that the Echad has to support a valid Taina, and in this case, the Taina is only a Tainus Shema. Now, again, I just want to leave one issue on the back burners. We'll have to come back to that. Let's put it in brackets. Why isn't it enough that Reuven sees that his vase is in the reshus of Shimon? Why doesn't that give him a Tainus Bari? Leave that out for a moment. That has to do with that everything is focused on that moment of the Gzela, the so-called Gzela, which the Echad testifies about. And if the Balabayas, the owner of the vase, the Tovea, was not there at the time that his vase was being taken out of his reshus, and therefore he cannot testify on a Masechet Gzela, or he cannot claim on a Masechet Gzela, even though he has an Echad to that effect, his Taina remains a Taina Shema. And it's not enough that he knows that his vase is sitting on the table of Shimon. Everything is focused on the Masechet Gzela. And Reuven was not available, he was not there at the time of the Masechet Gzela. And therefore Reuven cannot put forth a Tainus Bari. But the bottom line is that the Ravid quotes the Gaon who rejects the Rambam on the basis of the fact that Reuven does not have a Tainus Bari and he only has a Tainus Shema. And therefore what? There still is an Echad who testifies that Shimon went into Reuven's house and came out with a vase.
So the Rambam holds like Artosos.
It would seem that you're one step ahead of me, David, that the Ravid in the name of the Gaon is arguing that an Eid Echad could not generate a Shvuah if the Taina of the Toveh is a Tainus Shema, which, by the way, is not the first time we've encountered such a shita. We mentioned it in the rush at the end of Shevuas in the name of Rabbeinu Ephraim. And Rabbi Ephraim said that Ein Nishpa and Al Tainus Shema, even in the case of Eid Echad. Which means that Eid Echad in and of himself is not capable of generating a Shvuah. He can only support the claim and upgrade the claim of the Toveh. But in a case where the Toveh is a Tainus Shema, and a Tainus Shema could not generate a Shvuah, then the Eid Echad would not generate a Shvuah because on his own he cannot do so. He can only support a Taina, but here the Taina is a Tainus Shema that doesn't generate a Shvuah. But at the end, the Ravid says that Divrei Rav, we have other opinions here on this matter, and here's where David says very well that the Rambam would hold, which is really Shitas HaTosfos, that the Eid Echad in and of himself could generate a Shvuah. And even though the Tovea, we'll call him Reuven, was not present at the time of the so-called Gzela, and therefore he cannot claim, well, I know you're a Gazlan. And again, without getting into the issue, can't he identify that vase? So I'm just going to give you a balabatish answer. Let's say it's a manufactured vase. It's mass-produced. You need a Simon Muvha, like in Shevuas Aved. So he doesn't have a Simon Muvha. It's mass-produced. You open up the catalogs and you'll see many vases that are produced by the same company, that have the same colors and the same shape and the same artistic design, etc., etc. So the only way that the Tovea could have a Tainas Bari is if he would claim, I saw the Gzela. I saw you enter into my house and walk off with my vase. And he has an Eid Echad to support him. That would be a perfect case where even a Gaon, quoted by the Ravid, would agree that since Shimon the Nitba cannot take a Shvuah to be Machish the Eid Echad, therefore, he'd have to pay. But that's not the scenario of the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't say that the Tovea was there and present at the time of the Gzela, and he's claiming based on a Maisa Gzela that he saw, but rather the Baal Bais is saying, Gozel hu kli zebiyado. I recognize this kli, it was mine. How did it get to his living room? He must have stolen it from me. But that's all a Tainas Shem. Wonderful. The Baal Bais wasn't there present at the time of the Gzela, but the Eid Echad was there at the time of the Gzela. Why shouldn't the Nitba be forced to take a Shevuas Eid Echad to Machish Eid Echad, which of course he cannot do because he concedes that he went in and took this vase, and the Eid Echad is testifying, had there been two Eidim, he would have to pay. So we now have, Rabosai, if we line up the Shitos, we have a double machlokes, which is really one and the same, but they're arguing about two different scenarios. We have the machlokes between Tosfos and Rabbeinu Ephraim, and that revolves around a case. Well, actually, again, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let me backtrack. Let me reverse for a moment. We're going to have a machlokes between Tosfos in his first teretz, and we'll call it Tosfos in his second teretz. If we assume that Tosfos in his second teretz, Kofatz v'Nishpa, rejected Tosfos in his first answer, we'll make that assumption for the purpose of our discussion. And that's the question whether Eid Echad, who's supporting a tain of a Katan, could generate a Shevuah. And the Rambam and the Ravid are arguing about a different scenario, but it's identical in terms of the conceptual halachic consideration about a case where the Tovea is tining a tain Shema, and he's supported by the Eidus of Eid Echad. And the Gaon, like Rabbeinu Ephraim, is of the opinion that in such a case, there is no Chiyuv Shvuah, because the tain is a tain Shema. And we are absolutely convinced that logically this should be connected to the Rambam Shita about Eid Echad who supports the tain of a Katan. Because in both cases, the issue hinges on whether or not the Eid Echad has an independent power to generate a Shevuah. Or is he just simply supporting the taina of the tovea, of the litigant who is the plaintiff, as we call him, who is claiming the money. All this is fine and dandy based on the Rambam in Hilchos Gzeila. The problem is the Rambam in Hilchos Toin V'Nita. Perek Hey Halacha Tes. Ein nishbain al tainis cheres shota v'katan. Wait a second. Ein nishbain al tainis cheres shota v'katan. The Rambam should be qualifying this statement. Because it was the Rambam in Hilchos Gzeila who took the position that an Echad, independent of the time of the Toveh, could generate a Shevuah. And then we applied the principle of Mitoch Sheni Yochel Yishav Mishal. So we would anticipate that here the Rambam in Hilchos Toin V'Nita and Perek Hey should have qualified this statement, and he should have pointed out that, okay, Ein nishban al tainis cheres shot v'katan, b'mei dvar mamurim, in a case of a modu mixed taina, but not in a case of Eid Echad, because the Eid Echad has an independent power to be mechayev shvuah. But look what the Rambam says: Echad haba b'tainis atzmo, o b'tainis aviv. So let's take the case of a katan. The katan says, I know that this so-and-so Shimon owes me 1,000. Alternatively, I heard from my father that this Shimon borrowed $1,000. Lefisha zeha mikta shahodolo lekatan. Even if the nitma, the defendant, will counter with a claim that, yeah, I owe you 50 out of the 100. Nevertheless, the Rambam says, Ein nishban al tainis cheres shot v'katan. She'eno el kabesh v'aveda. Okay, that's the case of Modu Mixas. What about the case of Eid Echad? And the Rambam addresses this head on. V'cheinim kafar bakol. However, ba Eid Echad v'hei lekatan. The Eid Echad supports the claim of the katan. And the Rambam says, v'chein, the identical halacha that applies to a tainas shema will now apply to a tainas katan. Eino nishma. There's no shvuah. Shezeh Eid Echad v'yein sham tovea. Says the Rambam, very gleich, very smooth. You have an Eid Echad, but there's no tviyah. Because the taina of a katan is not a taina. Shetviyas katan eino tviyas gemura. So what is the Rambam saying? Is it A, that the Eid Echad stands on his own independent to be mechayev shvuah? Or is it B, that the Eid Echad is only supporting the taina of the tovea? And you see clearly the Rambam is saying that it's B, and the Eid Echad's power lies in the fact that he supports the tovea. Nimtzeis Omer, Katan Shomer Legadol Monoli Biyadcha. You owe me 100. That's what the Katan claims. Or Abba Haylo Biyadcha, or my father extended a loan of 100. Halo Omer Ein Lecha Biyadai Ela Chamisha. Okay, Modu Mixas. Oh, look at the Rambam's second possibility. Ein Lecha Biyadai Klum. I didn't take from you any money whatsoever, not a mana, and not a chatzi mana, not a fraction of a mana. But Eid Echad meido sheyesh lo, that Shimon is actually holding on to a mana of the katan. Hareze patur b'shvuas haTorah. The Eid Echad on his own, independent of a tefillah, cannot be mechayev shvuah. The Rambam is out. outspoken and as explicit you possibly could want. That an Eid Echad could be Machayev a Shvua only through the mechanism, through the vehicle of a Taina. And a Katan doesn't have the status of a Taina. So what do we do with the Rambam that we just saw in Hilchas Gzela, where you take a Shvua on the Taina of Eid Echad, even though the Eid Echad, when he says that so-and-so stole, he cannot be supporting a Taina of the Tovea because the Tovea doesn't know whether or not he stole. And he can't identify the object of the Yado, as we said before. So it comes out that the Rambam is splitting between two sub-issues, so to speak. One sub-issue is the case of Eid Echad and a Tainas Katan. And the other sub-issue is Eid Echad and a Tainas Shema. So the Rambam is willing to be Mechayev Shvuah Shel Torah in the case of Eid Echad with a Tainas Shema, but not in a case of an Eid Echad and a Tainas Katan. And honestly, our whole thesis, which we presented here from the beginning to the end, just simply falls apart. Our thesis was based on the assumption that we reduce everything to one question: is the Eid Echad standing on his own, or is he supporting the Taina of the Tovea? And yet the Rambam seems to differentiate between two cases. One case of Tainas Katan, and the Eid Echad could not generate a Tainas Katan. And in that sense, Tosfos, the Rambam belongs to the camp of Tosfos. We're going to have to say Kofetz v'Nishpa. But when it comes to the issue of Tainas Shema, the Rambam applies the principle Mitoch Sheni Yochel Yishav Mishalim. The Shvuah is generated by the Eid Echad. He's an independent generator, even though the Taina is a Tainas Shema. Now, somebody sent me a message, but I don't know exactly why. I'm not that familiar with the technology here. It just disappeared on me. Maybe I could get it back on the screen. Let me just see. Oh, no. So far. Oh, chat. Maybe it's, let me just see. Oh. Wait 1 second. Okay. So I don't see any questions that. Can we take a break now? Any questions? Any comments?
You have a teretz for the Rambam?
Well, what do you say, David? This is not a one-man show over here. It's not fair. You got to respect your elders here. You got to come to the fore and.
So maybe he holds like what the Ravid said, that it's a Tainas Bari in that case.
Excellent. The Rambam might say the following: that if the Tovea has doubts about whether the Nitba owes him the money or doesn't, then he could jump onto the shoulders, take a tramp or a piggyback on the Eid Echad. A Taina Shema is a Taina. It doesn't generate a Shvuah. But if that Taina could be supported, it could be upgraded to the status of a Taina's Bari. Again, we have to ask the question, how can you do so? How can you support a Taina Shema and transform it in such a way that now it can generate a Shvuah? And that's the Rambam that we started with in Hilchas Gzela Perik Daled in the case of Eid Echad. But wait a second, that doesn't fit with the issue of the Rambam here in Hilchas Toim V'Nitan Perik, because in Toim V'Nitan we're talking about a Katan who doesn't have a Taina. It's a Gavra Hamufka Mitaina, Mitoras Taina or Chalushem Taina. He doesn't have a Toras Taina. Well, let's just see if this can make any sense. We said in the Rambam, in Hilchas Gzela, that Reuven was not there at the time of the Gzela. However, we also said that Reuven recognizes, at least in his perception, the vase that's now being held on to, being possessed by Shimon. So let's ask Reuven the following question. How did Shimon get that vase? Well, maybe he bought it on the open market. Maybe it's not your vase. Maybe you never had that. You never possessed it. Now he hears an Echad testifying that I saw this no good Shimon enter into your house and walk out with your vase. Oh, wait a second. Reuven now says to himself, I am absolutely convinced that Shimon's possession of this vase was not, it didn't just fly down from the heavens. It wasn't that he went into the store and he bought this vase. He took it from my house. This is my vase. So normally I can't identify metaltalin. Maybe I have a tvias ayin. It looks like mine. I can't be sure. But now that the Echad testifies that Shimon went into my house and he took a vase, I'm going to bounce back with a tainas bari. Am I absolutely certain that it's my vase? Can't be totally certain, but I can rely on Echad. In other words, the Echad puts a certain, picture on the circumstantial evidence around this case. And if that be the case, then maybe, just maybe, the Rambam is arguing that we can put 1 + 1 together and generate a tainas bari on behalf of Reuven. That Reuven, in effect, says, I know that you stole my vase. That's my vase. You're holding on to it. And the Echad is testifying that you got it by entering into my house and walking out with it. I know now, without a shadow of a doubt, that you have stolen my vase. And now we have the following scenario. The Nitba, Shimon, cannot deny that he went in and he took out the vase. He confesses that the Echad is telling the truth. He cannot be makish the Echad, and the Echad is mechayev shvua. Now, why is the Echad mechayev shvua? And the answer is because, based on the testimony of the Echad, Reuven the Tovea is able to tainas bari. That's not going to help us in the case of a Katan. Even if the Katan were to rely 1,000% on the honesty and the integrity of the Echad, he still ends up with a tainas Katan. And the Torah says, Ki yiten ish v'lo Katan. He cannot generate a shvuah. So it comes out, Rabbosai, now that we've taken a whole 180-degree turnabout in terms of how to understand the Rambam. We thought that the Rambam was holding that you don't need a taina in order to generate a shvuah. That Echad on his own, independent of the taina, could generate a shvuah. Name. We're throwing that out now in light of the Rambam in Toiv V'Nitan Perikei. And we're saying that according to the Rambam, Eid Echad could not generate a shvuah. Eid Echad can only support a taina, and the taina will generate the shvuah. And that's why the Rambam says explicitly here in Hilchas Toiv and Nitan Perkei that even though the Eid Echad is testifying on behalf and supporting the Taina of the Katan, there's no Shvuah, and that's because the Eid Echad independently cannot be Mechayiv Shvuah. He only can support a Taina and Ein Nishbar El Taina's Katan. But in the case of the Rambam Hilchas Gzela, that's a whole other story. The Rambam holds that the Eid Echad could now upgrade the status of the Taina of the Tovei of Ruvain. Ruvain is now absolutely convinced that Shimon's holding on to his vase because he came into his house and he stole it from his house. And therefore, relying on the testimony, on the credibility of the Eid Echad, Ruvain now comes back with a Tainas Bari. And that Tainas Bari is supported by an Eid Echad, and therefore the Nitbaz Chayav Shvu. Is that what you had in mind, David?
No, I was saying maybe like the Ravid speculated that maybe the Rambam holds that in that particular case, since he sees his object with Shimon, this is a Tainas Bari. I'm not saying no, that's right.
Because the Rambam seems to be making a big deal about the fact that the Tovea, meaning Ruvain, wasn't there at the time of the Gzela. All right. Now, Rabbosai, how are we doing on the clock? We still have a few minutes. What is 10 to 2 on your clock? Just 10
to 9.
10 to 9. And we started at
quarter to
8. Oh, 10 to 9. All right, so let me just then leave the Rambam. I gave you a Rambam Hilchas Shevuas to look at. Am I correct? Did I send it to you or not? I don't have my phone. Anyway, I just want to summarize for 5 minutes, even less, what we learned. And if I could emphasize that I'd like you to look at the Rambam Perek Yud Aleph Hilchas Shevuas Halacha Hey. I think I sent it to you. If not, can you write it down? Okay. There are 3 shitas now.
It was sent to the WhatsApp group.
I did? Hilchas Shevuas. Okay. So let's just summarize 3 shitos now. Tosfos is of the opinion that an Eid Echad could be Mechayev a Shvuah independent of the Taina. All we have is a Taina's Katan. The Ravid holds that Eid Echad could be Mechayev a Shvuah only in the case of a Taina's Bari. And the Rambam holds that even in the case of a Taina's Shema, if the Eid is testifying on behalf of the Tovea who has only a Taina's Shema, it allows the Tovea to upgrade his Taina to a Taina's Bari. And the Eid now is able, again, through the mechanism of the Taina, to be Mechayev Shvuah. So we really have 3 different shitas. Once again, just to summarize for my sake, Tosfos holds that Eid Echad is Mechayev Shvuah independent of a Taina. And that's the case of a Katan. The Ravid holds that an Echad cannot be Mechayev Shvuah. He's only to support a Taina. And if the Taina is a Taina Shema, and Kolshkein, if it's a Taina's Katan, there's no Chiyuv Shvuah. The Rambam is the middle Shita. The Rambam differentiates between Eid Echad, who is supporting a Taina's Shema, and Eid Echad, who is supporting a Taina's Katan. In the latter case, the Rambam agrees that there's no Chiyuv Shvuah, because Eid Echad, like Shitas Ravid, cannot be Mechayev Shvuah on his own. Where does the Rambam disagree with the Ravid? That's the case of Taina's Shema. And the Ravid is Mechadesh. The Rambam is Mechadesh that the Eid Echad supporting the Taina of the Tovea could upgrade the status of a Taina's Shema to that of a Taina's Bari. Okay then? So Mr. Hashem, next Tuesday we'll see each other face to face, unless you tell me you want to share on Hanukkah or something like that. And I'll wish you all the best. Okay then?
Safe trip.
Very much.
Have a safe trip back.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. My plane leaves tomorrow.